Welcome to another Founders Day celebration. Thank you very much for joining us online. Here at the Danquah Institute, we are very excited to be celebrating another Founders Day. We see it symbolically as a celebration of our forefathers, and we remember the institution of the celebration of this day on the 16th of April in 2019, when His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Ghana, Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, assented to the Public Holidays Amendment Act and established the Founders Day. For us, it's also important that all Ghanaians sit and reflect on how our founding fathers struggled and built this foundation for a very strong democracy, which we are all benefiting from today. And so here at the Institute, every year, we continue and we are resilient that we will keep celebrating and marking the day, if not for anything at all, with a lecture, with something that enlightens us on what our forefathers did. This is what has built for us the strong pillars of our democracy, and it is also what led to our fight for our independence. Last year, we hosted a panel discussion here at the Institute titled Our Heroes and the Fight for Democracy. Today we are marking this special day with another lecture. And if you want to see what we did last year, you can go on our website. We have YouTube videos and we have some publications from the independence struggle, Our Heroes and the Fight for Democracy. Today we are honored to be hosting another virtual lecture, and we have with us a senior lecturer from the University of Ghana, Dr. Lawrence Boakye, who will be speaking to us on the topic, African Nationalism, a Road to Patriotism and the Attainment of Self-Determination. This year's virtual lecture promises to be very insightful, exciting, and full of information. Dr. Lawrence Boakye would enlighten us on the attainment of self-determination as a country and the foundation laid for the nation by our forefathers to achieve this self-determination. He further has promised to give us a very engaging and patriotic projection of our nation in a very positive light. The lecture would last for between 30 to 45 minutes, after which we would engage you, our audience, in very, very fruitful discussions, questions, and comments. We hope that you would sit with us, you'd stay with us, and you'd enjoy this as we bring you most enlightening information for our Founders Day. Thank you very much. So I'd like to give a short brief of Dr. Lawrence Boakye before he starts the lecture. Dr. Boakye studied at the University of the Holy Cross in Rome, where he got his PhD in politics and ethics in 2009. Dr. Boakye further did his postdoctoral studies at the University of Dallas in the US. He did extensive research in international relations, peace building, and conflict resolution strategies, and he has published extensively in these areas. He also holds 2 postgraduate international certificates in academic practices from the United Kingdom and the United States of America. Dr. Boakye has taught political philosophy and diplomacy at the University of Dallas in the USA, as well as in Rome, Italy. Currently, he lectures at the University of Ghana in the area of politics, philosophy, indigenous knowledge systems. Dr. Boakye's areas of research focus on philosophy, politics, and culture relating to contemporary issues of human sciences and development. Dr. Boakye, I'm very, very welcome to the Danquah Institute. We are very happy to host you today on Founders Day. We trust you are doing well. Thank you. We're very excited to have you today. I think this is the first time we are hosting you on our platform, and we are hoping that you join us many, many, many more times to give more information out to the public. So thank you, all of you, for joining us online, our very cherished audience and listeners who always participate in our lecture. I will now hand over to Dr. Lawrence Boakye, and he will deliver his lecture to us. Thank you very much. Doc, please, you can move up.
So once again, good morning to all of us this morning. My lecture is actually going to base on African nationalism, a road to patriotism and the struggle for self-determination. I'm just going to go under a few subtopics. I will do the introduction, where it will be basically relating to historical analysis and narratives. Then I will look at African nationalism, what it means by itself. Then I also look at colonial oppression, independence movements. Then I will touch on briefly on the Big Six. Then I'll conclude from there. So this is just a way of trying to reminisce about our past. A day like this is very important for us to reflect on what has happened and why we have get to this far in our democracy. So to begin, African nationalism is a subjective feeling of kinship or affinity shared by people of African descent. It is a feeling based on shared cultural norms, traditional institutions, racial heritage, and common historical experiences. One enduring historical experience shared by nearly all Africans was colonial oppression. Along with this sense of shared identity is a collective desire to maintain one's own culture, social and political values, independent of outside control. It is worth stressing that African nationalism, like nationalism elsewhere in the world, is not something new. It is as old as ancient times. In fact, in Africa, contrary to a common view in Western scholarship of Africa, African nationalism predates colonialism itself. In the annals of African history, one finds coherent, organized African communities with a strong sense of identity, prepared to defend their territorial and cultural integrity against those who would want to destroy or undermine them. For instance, when the great African king Mansa Musa of Mali was on pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, 1325, the Wolof people who had been forcibly brought under the Mali kingdom seized the opportunity to rebel against the Mali kingdom itself. The Wolof people were expressing a nationalism, a separate national identity, and a desire to govern themselves in their own land. We also know that Africans do not passively accept European rule, which was alien and destructive of the African social order. The effective resistance put up against European colonization by the Ashanti people of Ghana, for example, the Hehe of Tanzania, or the Zulus of South Africa suggests a very strong sense of national identity that was already in place, and a fierce determination not to succumb to any other authority but their own. The king of the Yao people in Tanzania had this to say to a German commander who had been sent to him to affirm the German colonial claim to his country in 1890. And he said this: "I have listened to your words, but can find no reason why I should obey you. I would rather die first. If it should be friendship that you desire, then I am ready for it, today and always. But to be your subject, that I cannot be. If it should be war you desire, then I am ready, but never to be your subject. I do not fall at your feet, for you are God's creature just as I am. I am a sultan here in my land, and you are a sultan there in yours as well. Yet listen, I do not say to you that you should obey me, for I know that you are a free man. As for me, I will not come to you, and if you are strong enough, then come and fetch me." That was the response he gave to them. Also, a Ghanaian king, Prempeh I of Asante, in the same tone, declined the British offer of protection, which was actually an euphemism for control of the colonial master. He said that his kingdom wished to remain on friendly terms with all white people and to do business with them. But he saw no reason why the Asante kingdom should ever commit itself to such a policy with the British government. The British took over the country anyway. The king was exiled for several years to an Indian Ocean island for non-cooperation, and violent tensions between the Ashanti people and the British continued for 90 years, well into the beginning of the 20th century. One time, the king of the Moshi people of Burkina Faso told the French captain, "I know the whites wish to kill me, to take my country, and yet you claim that they will help me to organize my country. But I find my country good just as it is. I have no need of them. I know what is necessary for me and what I want. I have my own merchants, and also consider yourself fortunate that I do not order your head to be cut off. So go away now, and above all, never come back." However, the French never went away, and the Moshi people lost their country. Another leader of the Nama people in the modern Namibia told one German officer, "The Lord has established various kingdoms in the world. I know and believe that it is no sin or crime that I would wish to remain the independent chief of my own land, of my own people." The Germans were not impressed either, so they continued to stay. Westerners, for their own reason, chose to call these groups tribes, even though many of them were extremely large with well-structured social and political institutions. Ample evidence showed that these groups were nations occupying specific territories that they were willing to defend if threatened or attacked. The sentiment expressed by these kings and leaders demonstrate nothing but nationalism by people who wanted either such relations with foreigners as existing between equals or to be left alone. Group sentiments that emerge in Eastern European countries also has a similar connotation, not unlike what one would have seen in Africa as the eve of the European scramble for our continent. For example, when the Soviet Union collapsed, its former republics split off, some of them facing internal conflict as various groups sought to retreat into linguistic and cultural enclaves. Yugoslavia, for example, disintegrated, throwing its people into a nasty civil war. Czechoslovakia ended in 1992 with agreement to split into countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, which binds all these groups, and here in Africa is a common heritage based on religion, language, and historical experiences. It is very clear then that historical experiences of living under foreign hegemony or being governed by political parties thought to be manipulated by an outside power has been a potent force and a potent drive behind national secessionist attempts in Eastern Europe as well as in modern Africa as well. Today, after colonial rule had been firmly established, Africans continue to exhibit many forms of defection and resistance. Because Africa has been sliced into different colonies, as the resistance coalesced, organizations formed to protest various elements of colonial rule were often based on the territory under one colonial power, such as France, Britain, or Germany. Since it was virtually impossible for Africans to organize on a countrywide basis, regional or ethnic organizations became the most practical option for them to resist. Because the colonizer was European and the colonized was an African, such organizations came to be seen, particularly by outsiders, almost entirely in racial terms. It served the colonial masters' powers' interest for them not to only play ethnic groups against one another, but also to characterize the more militant or outspoken ones as being anti-white. For example, the Mau Mau uprising against British rule in Kenya is a perfect example of a movement that was presented in the Western media as aimless, fanatically violent rebellion bent on killing and maiming any white person for the fun of it. Such a racial interpretation was simplistic and very wrong. The goal of such interpretation was to divorce the struggle from the legitimate grievances that undergirded these situations. As I already pointed out, European colonizers had some racial motives for seizing African territories, but the Africans simply wanted their territories back and the freedom to live their lives as they saw fit. This surge in African nationalism was fueled by several catalytic factors besides the oppressive colonial experience itself. Some of the external factors included the establishment of missionary churches, World War I and II, the ideology of Pan-Africanism, and also the League of Nations or the United Nations. As it has been pointed out, colonization was mostly a negative, exploitative, and oppressive experience for Africans. Africans have bad memories of these experiences, even though some may appear to have benefited materially. They humiliated, their culture were denigrated and distorted, and their land was confiscated. European immigrants who were encouraged to come to Africa as pioneer farmers were given large tracts of land to farm. Large plantations were established for growing cash crops, and they forced the African to provide cheap labor, which resulted in severe consequences for the African communities. How could anyone expect Africans to resent or not to resent this after a while? In fact, at the beginning of the colonial occupation, the African resistance took the form of armed revolt. The Temne and the Mende of Sierra Leone revolted against a specific tax that were put on them. The Nama and the Herero people in Namibia revolted against the German forced labor. And evidence of severed human limbs and ears in King Leopold's Congo proved that many Africans were resisting forced labor as well. These kinds of revolts were very typical of primary resistance, spontaneous, and they were local uprisings. They were not militarily successful, though, for obvious reasons, including the lack of countrywide organizational base, and were brutally suppressed as well. So later on, some of these countries developed or adopted strategies that were more moderate, and they employed conventional means to confront these issues. So they began to form associations for the purposes of addressing specific grievances such as low wages, poor educational and health facilities, inadequate prices for cash crop grown by African farmers, lack of business opportunities, and absence of representation in local political councils. When these forms were thwarted by colonial settlers, who were loath for not spending any money on natives or to share any of their power with Africans, or when the colonial officers in their metropole decided that Africans were not yet ready for reforms, then the African ultimately began to think about self-rule as the ultimate answer. It has been suggested that the concept of political freedom was alien to the African people, that Africans were traditionally and had no sense of democracy. African societies, to be sure, had this collective purpose and a collective societies in which the needs and rights of the communities preceded those of the individual. But collective ethos should not be equated to the lack of appreciation for a personal freedom as well. Some African communities exercised a great deal of consultation in an atmosphere of unfettered debate and discussion. Leaders were chosen and held accountable for their actions. Those who resisted the wishes and demands of their people were often overthrown and replaced. In some societies, hereditary rule was permitted only so long as leaders performed according to standards accepted and sanctioned by communities. When a leader was incompetent or betrayed, the people's trust by unfair or cruel ruling that was abused was also brought to their attention. The person was actually sometimes voted out and another leader chosen from a different house or family to substitute this particular person. So it is not true that Africans had no sense of democracy. So it was for these reasons that in 1921, in the Pan-African Conference, which was conducted in 3 seasons held in London, Brussels, and Paris, respectively, these issues became a central point of discussion. The first session of the conference reiterated in some important demands that were backed by an eloquent assertion concerning the inherent equality of human beings. A presentation named Declaration of the World was delivered by the conference president at that time, Du Bois, and it was worth quoting at some length what he said. And he says this: "The absolute equality of races, physical, political, and social, is the founding stone of the world and human advancement. No one denies great differences of gift, capacity, and attainments among individuals of all races. But the voice of science and religion and practical politics is one in denying the God-appointed existence of super races or of races naturally, inevitably, and eternally inferior. That in the vast range of time, one group should, in its industrial technique or social organization or spiritual vision, lag a few hundred years behind another, or forge fitfully ahead, or come to differ decidedly in thought, deed, and ideal, is proof of the essential riches and variety of human nature, rather than proof of a coexistence of demigods and apes in a human form. The doctrine of racial equality does not interfere with the individual liberty. That's what he said. Rather, it fulfills it in its own way. And of all the various criteria of which masses of men have in the past been prejudiced and classified, that of color of skin and the texture of hair is surely the most adventitious and very idiotic. Quote closed. Much has been made of the fact that African nationalism was not quite like that of Europe, because there were no states like those in Europe when colonization actually occurred. There are, however, many African groups with strong historical and social identities comparable to the ethnic and national groups of Europe as well. When colonial authorities drew boundaries, they did not pay any regard to the actual distribution of the various national people and ethnic communities. Thus, the geographical entities that have been drawn to the convenience of European contained diversities of people. Ethnically, homogeneous colonies were rare. What is important for our discussion here is that these diverse African groups, they managed, and they were being governed by one colonial authority. They were able to stay together through their leaders to forge a sense of belonging to that of geographical entity. In political terms, African nationalism began to assert itself primarily after the World War II. Organizations through which nationalism were channeled were varied and heterogeneous. William Taddoff identifies 7 social groups that really contributed in trying to seek freedom from colonialism as well. We had professional groups that were consisting of lawyers and doctors who tended to be allied with wealthy merchants and contractors. We also had teachers, clerks, and small merchants, or what the Marxian term will call it, the petty bourgeoisie, who were impatient with the status quo and eager to have the system transformed so that they can better themselves and perhaps help other people as well. The colonial bureaucracy, including westernized Africans who were the immediate beneficiaries of Africanization of top government positions, were also part of it as well. We had the urban workers interested in improving their wages and working conditions through trade unions. Then we also have the small shopkeepers, petty traders, and hawkers, who made up of the informal sector of the colonial economies. Then also we had the cash crop farmers, some of whom were wealthy, and all of whom constituted a powerful and important segment of the Africans. Peasant farmers were also part of it, who toiled on their small farms in the countryside and grew most of the food eaten in the country. Peasant consent had to do with agriculture, and they also protested policies that controlled the market price of their produce in the urban centers as well. African nationalism was therefore composed of a number of different elements, representing sometimes interlocking but often divergent economic interests, which united temporarily in an anti-colonial struggle as well. So the nationalist struggle was waged in part by religious associations, by these trade unions and welfare organizations, as well as various political parties as well. In the case of religious associations, mission churches in Africa were closely identified with the colonial rule from the very beginning. Many African churchgoers broke away in order to be able to practice their own customs, such as funeral rites, marriages, celebrations, and modes of dressing as well. Therefore, you see that there was an early secession of churches which occurred in Nigeria and South Africa, somewhere around 1890s. Then these churches like the Zionist Church were founded by charismatic individuals who claimed to have received a divine calling to lead their own people to spiritual and political salvation. They are analogous to present-day fundamentalist groups and were characterized by spontaneity and emotionalism as well. Examples of such churches were Kubangu and Kitawala churches in the Congos. In Kenya, we have Daniya Musambwa, Religion of the Spirits, founded by Elijah Misinde, who preached against colonial rule and attacked foreign religions as a deviation from the African's old and revered cultural ways as well. It campaigned for cultural authenticity and was wrongly sympathetic to the uprising of the Mau Mau people as well. Ironically, even after independence came, Misende, for example, did not relent in his attack against the government. He believed that even Kenyatta, his government, was just an un-African in his within his own colonial predecessors as well. Misende spent a great deal of his life in detention until he died. As one can expect, leaders of radical religious movements were found to be equally threatening. Some were jailed and some were executed as well. Then we have trade unions and welfare organizations that were formed in towns and which began to grow, particularly after the Second World War. So you see that what they were looking for is assisting and helping other people that were moving from the rural areas to the urban areas. Members who were interested in the trade unions were the ones who were given accommodations, jobs, spending money, and they supported their friends who came into the big city to fight for their own destiny. In this case, in British colonies, for example, these kind of tribal associations with parochial interests and regional bases were encouraged because they met the needs that the colonial authority did not have the resources or the inclination to address. So trade unions also began to organize on a sectorial basis since they were not permitted to go national or to become political. Trade union leaders realized that without the strength of the numbers from the national base, they would not be able to be strong enough to improve the working conditions of their own members as well. Moreover, we have the leaders of these organizations became a pool from which political organizations later on began to draw its strength as well. In some cases, the trade union themselves became indistinguishable from nationalist movements as well. For example, Tom Mboya of Kenya began his career as the head of the local government workers' union in Nairobi, while also serving as an official of the Kenyan African Union. When Mboya was elected General Secretary of the Kenyan Federation of Labor in 1953, he attacked draconian colonial measures that included mass removals of African families from their homes and the practice of collective punishment and the introduction of the Kipande, the passbook, for controlling the movement of Africans in the country. Then when you come to Guinea, we have Sekou Touré, also began his political career as a trade unionist, as we know. As a general secretary of the CGT Guinea, he used African trade unions for political education and mass mobilization. During a long strike in 1953, he stressed that workers' unity was essential to any success and preached against tribalism as well. Many of these political parties and trade unions also happened all across Africa, in Nigeria, in Morocco, in Cameroon, in Zambia, and they maintained their autonomy to concentrate, especially with issues that were bordering on economics and other things that could make African people feel comfortable in their own countries. Many of these political parties began as interest groups as well. They were composed of educated African civil lawyers, civil servants, doctors, and pastors, often living in the urban areas. They were originally moderate, reasonable, and interested only in the limited reforms. They were not this kind of mass movement and did not try to supplant the colonial government, as a matter of fact. One of the earliest such groups was Aborigines Right Protection Society, founded in 1897 in Ghana. That was meant to ensure that the African people did not lose their rights to their own lands. In the same way, too, the Nigerian Congress of British West Africa, composed of educated Africans from the West African British colonies of Gold Coast, Ghana, were also involved in this as well. We have the Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Gambia. All wanted the right to vote extended to everybody in the country, especially the educated people of Africa. Its leader, a respected lawyer by the name Kisley Hayford, once said that our interests as a people are identical with those of the Eho Empire as well. Apart from this, we also see some political parties also began as youth movements A primary example will be the Nigerian youth movement, which began in Lagos, known as Lagos Youth Movement in 1934. That was formed hastily by young people to protest the establishment of an African college in Lagos, which was to require the same amount of time training, but will only issue diploma instead of college degrees for their own black African students as well. So we have people like Dr. Inandi Ezekwe, who headed this Nigerian youth movement at one time, but political squabbles because of that within the organization forced him to leave, taking with him some of the leaders to establish the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons in 1944, which led on to greater things as well. Now, at this point, let us draw attention to our own country. In Ghana, too, a lot were happening at that time. Things were not all that good for the African, or for the Ghanaian in this case. So today, as we stand here, we are trying to remember our founding fathers of the United Gold Coast Convention Party, the UGCC. Just as I have narrated to you the struggle for self-determination, the struggle for independence, the struggle to rule ourselves. In our country right here, these men and other people also began the same fight. Today, we remember Kwame Nkrumah. We talk about Ebenezer Akwagyei, Edward Akufo-Addo, Joseph Boachi Danquah, Emmanuel Obechebi Lamte, and William Oforiatta. These great men of our dear nation understood that the continued existence of colonialism was going to prevent the development of international economic cooperation. It will impede the social, the cultural, and economic development of our nation. And this will militate against the ideals of universal peace. For these reasons, these men and many others risked their lives for this country. Today, as we celebrate these courageous compatriots, we reflect on their heroism, their sacrifice, their leadership, the restoration of patriotism, and the establishment of the foundation of our democracy. We have not forgotten, for example, the Awam boycott. It was an organized boycott of European imports, which took place in 1948. The aim was to get the foreign traders known as the Association of West African Members, known as Awam, to reduce prices of their goods. This was also followed with a series of riots in the early hours, in the early months of 1948. The boycotts were scheduled to end in 28 February 1948, a day that has become significant in the history of Ghana. Today, you even know that the word Awam has become a term synonymous with cheating and profiteering in Ghana today. We have not forgotten also what happened also in 20th of February 1948, when J.B. Danquah and Dr. Kwame Nkrumah addressed World War II veterans who had been agitating for their end-of-service benefits following the war at the Palladium Cinema, Accra. These veterans had fought in the war and they were not being paid their gratuities on their return home. So Kwame Nkrumah and J.B. Danquah both gave their support and encouraged the veterans in their protests over the post-war neglect. So it followed subsequently that on the 28th of February of the same month, what we know as the Christian Borg Castle Road shooting also occurred. It was following this particular inspiration coming from Nkrumah and J.B. Danquah when some war veterans marched to the Christian Borg Castle, the seat of the colonial government. They intended to submit a petition to the governor, Sir Gerard Creasy, about their poor conditions, their unpaid war benefits, and their neglects. So there and then we know that from history, one police superintendent called Corin Imre, a British police officer, ordered the veterans to disperse, but they refused. He then ordered his men to open fire on the unarmed soldiers, and they also refused. So he himself, he opened fire, and in the course of doing that, he killed 3 courageous men, namely Sergeant Colonel Frederick Ajite, Private Odate Lamte, and Corporal Atipo. So on the same day, then the UGCC had to come up sit down and sent a message to the Secretary of State in London. And I want to read the message, shortly for all of us to know what it meant. And they said this: unless colonial government is changed and a new government of the people and their chiefs installed at the center immediately, the conduct of masses, now completely out of control, with strikes threatening police quarters and rank-and-file police indifference to orders of officers, would continue and result in worse, violent, and irresponsible acts by uncontrolled people. We are prepared and ready to take over interim government. We ask in the name of the oppressed, the inarticulate, the misruled, and the misgoverned people and their chiefs, that a special commissioner be sent out immediately to hand over government to interim government of the people and to witness immediate calling of constituent assembly. Quotation closed. And that was one powerful information. That whatever be the case, we want to go our own way, whether good or bad. And that is some of the important things that we don't have to forget in our history. So we will not today also forget about of other Ghanaians, such as Ni Kwabena Boni, K. Gbadema, the market women at that time, ex-servicemen, political groups such as Convention People's Party, the Aboriginals Right Protection Society, National Liberation Movement, Northern People's Party, the Muslim Association Party. These all people, they all played significant roles in raising the consciousness of Ghanaians regarding freedom and what we meant by self-rule. In our circumstance today, the only factor that can enkindle our passion to contribute magnanimously to the development and progress of our nation is our patriotic values. When we lack this quality, we throw our destiny into chaos, dishonesty, apathy, and dismay, turning back our clock of development. Our Founders' Day celebration today comes with a clarion call to ask all of us some vital questions regarding our country, Ghana. Where do you want to go from here? What is our vision for tomorrow? As a people, what are our aspirations? What do we lack as a nation? What is our vision for Mother Ghana? May the resilience of our past leaders continue to enkindle and awaken the civil consciousness in us, our desire for proper identity, for freedom, unity, self-determination, and the restoration of the spirit of patriotism. Our self-determination and our patriotic values are integral to the realization of our freedoms as well. It is only through these factors, out of this, that our basic rights of people we can determine without compulsion or coercion, holding into our own hands our future, our own political status, and our independent mindset. Then with this, we can continue to fight for other values like dignity, justice, progress, and equity. To conclude, although most African states achieve independence peacefully through negotiation, it is nevertheless that we have to pay attention that a lot of these countries also have to go through a process of transition from colonialism to independence through struggle as well. Africans were never simply asked, when do you wish to become independent? We had to fight for ourselves. They had to determine their own independence. They had to agitate for it. Many agitators went to jail. Some of them were banished from their own countries for a long period of time, and some even lost their lives. It is used to be said that the surest path to becoming the prime minister of an English-speaking African country was through jail. Indeed, we know. It happened to Kenyatta, Nkrumah, and Banda of Malawi. And many others served time in colonial jails before they became leaders of their own country. We also have to remember the plethora of factors that mediated the struggle for independence, such as colonial education, the role of the church, ideas, and expressions of support from individuals of African ancestry through the Pan-African movement, the exposure to the world through world wars And of course, the forum that was provided briefly by the League of Nations and later the United Nations as well. It is interesting that the Christian church and colonial education became pivotal tools also in the European civilizing missions in Africa, and also inadvertently became the tools that the African would use in fighting for his own freedom. So despite the atomizing impact of the divide and the rule policies employed by the colonial authorities, which we described earlier on, it is remarkable indeed that African people were able to wage unified movements. The struggle mirrored all the contradictions of African societies that existed before colonialism and which has persisted since then as well. In any event, more than 40 to 50 years down the line of our independence, it shows that this winning freedom from European colonial powers is just the beginning of a long, tortuous road of liberation, nation building, and democracy. We have a long way to go as Africans, but let us begin to forge together. And that is what this day, trying to come back with the history, trying to bring the memory back about the spirit that our forefathers put in front of them, the self-sacrifice, the ability to let go and risk their life to let the truth prevail in our country, Ghana. It's very important, especially to our the youth of today, that we begin to teach them, educate them about these important values so that we don't lose the focus. Because this country must succeed. This country must prosper. And we can do that only and only when we think about patriotism, self-sacrifice, and the ability to be able to pursue our interests without fear and without favor. The promise of better Ghana is ahead of us. So as we think of these wonderful people who have done so much across the whole continent, let us ask also ourselves, how do we go on? How do we take the baton and move on from here? So with this, let's continue to forge on in good faith and build our country, Ghana, as we move on. May God bless us all. And I thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So, Doc, you have given us an amazing lecture. Probably will be a bit too difficult to summarize, but I think that you have come clearly giving us a lot about our past, what has happened, how Africa was divided, sliced into different territories, a lot about African nationalism, and even what remains in our democracy today. I think most especially, you've put a lot of emphasis on elements of African nationalism, or what should we say, components. You talked about the religious associations, trade unions, and then you were very emphatic on the various political organizations. Coming to talk about the importance of religious groups and what remains today, I think it's also very significant when we come to talk, because I think today we see a lot of different religious groups, and this definitely relates to what then happened at that time. Do you believe that religion has contributed a lot to the African, should we describe it as an African emancipation? But we see today a kind of a new Africanism. Do you think religion has had a role to play in this as well?
Yes, definitely. Religion has had a role, and as I said, towards the end of the 19th century, we saw a lot of African religious men and women leaving the missionary churches, for example. And I think they wanted to find God from their own point of view. And that is why it became a very important factor in this moment of self-determination. So Mozambique Christo Church, the Zionist Church, and all these churches, they broke away because they wanted to see God from their own point of view. And that is another interesting aspect of the whole narrative, whereby we realize that as they got to know God, they also became very conscious. Because I think getting to know God is also about self-determination. Getting to know your God brings you liberation. It doesn't have to enslave you. So later on, I mentioned how even the missionary churches, by training the African, it turned out to become that they became so intelligent and they began to seek their own purpose in life by finding ways and means to detach themselves from them as well. Mm-hmm. So religion has played a very vital role. Apart from education and other things that we had, religion played a very vital role. Today, things have changed, I know. But in those days, that was the beginning of self-awareness, self-consciousness, and the idea of self-determination, whereby I see by God from my own point of view, but not something that somebody is trying to impose on me.
So then do you believe that today we should begin to incorporate in our religious activities more? There's been that discussion on radio. I mean, some media have picked it up and have said it is time for us to take our democracy to the pulpit.
Yeah.
To allow patriotism to be a part of the discussion at the pulpit. Yes. Because if we do not push for religion, which is a huge movement in Africa, to now agree that issues of governance, issues of patriotism, peace, conflict, etc., should also be at the pulpit, then we wouldn't achieve some of these aims. Exactly. Development issues especially.
Exactly, yes.
And we can talk about the very amazing conference held by the Pentecost Church.
Yeah, church
recently, a week ago. A social development, actually a national development conference.
Yeah.
So if we do start taking some of these discussions to the pulpit, it would strengthen our patriotism. It would strengthen our development. I think you agree with that.
Yes,
that's the way that the conversation should be going.
That's going. Yeah, it's true because over 70% Ghanaians are Christians, for example, and 15% are Muslims. So religion is big, it's huge, and it has a vital role to play looking the way forward. And I think we may have to start conscientizing and bringing the discussion in front of the people, because that is how it's supposed to be as well. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to allow audience to ask questions in a few minutes, but I'll just deepen the discussion a bit further, and then we can go to the question time. Right, There's also another very important point that you made during your delivery. You talk about trade unions.
Yeah.
And I think this was also a very phenomenal aspect of the whole African nationalism struggle, and our struggle for independence. I like the way you broke it down and said it was organized actually on a sectorial basis.
Yes.
So you had different sectors coming together.
Yeah.
So what do you see? Do you see a replica of it in our democracy today, where we have different unions all fighting and agitating? Or you think that we have evolved, we've put it in a different way? What would you say is the difference between what was then and what we see now?
Yeah, and maybe what we see now is slightly different because it's some areas you see the political colors emerging around it. But if you look back, hawkers, market women, these people were the ones who were fighting for liberation in Africa. You have lawyers, you have teachers, all different forms of organizations were coming up. And I think they were hungry for something, which is self-determination. Maybe today we are taking things a little bit slightly comfortable to some extent. Therefore, a discussion may not go deeply into what Ghanaians are actually looking for. So it is the same thing, because for me, I find trade unions very, very important in every country, especially in Africa. Because if you look at every single country, uprising, the need for liberation, most of these countries have actually used these organizations to attain independence in their own way. Because that is what it is. The power belongs to the people. And that is why it is very, very important to continue, maybe find a proper objective for our trade unions today, to be able to see what we actually need as a unified group of people for the future of our country as well. Yes.
Thank you very much, Doc. And then finally, I think another point of discussion I'd like us to have before we go to the question session is then on the various political organizations.
Yeah.
And you began with a brief discussion on the Aborigines' rights
Protection.
Aborigines rights protection.
Yes, yeah.
Yes,
Precisely.
and other like organizations. You said there were some of them in Nigeria and Kenya.
In Kenya.
And all
Yeah,
other parts
yes,
of Africa.
Yeah, Africa, yeah.
And you also then talked about the birth of the Nnamdi Azikiwe type of people, and how that also influenced African nationalism.
Yeah, it's true, yeah.
I like that. I want to ask again that, do you see similar things happening today?
Yeah.
Today, do you see such social movements being very impactful in our political discourse? Yeah.
Yes, these days, maybe in a different form. I like the youth uprising that happened in Nigeria, for example, a few years back, where the youth will actually find ways and means to let their grievances be heard. It wasn't an easy movement, and wasn't an easy step for them to take. But when I saw those things happening and some of them were being killed, it brought back these memories of what it used to be in those days. You know? So yes, these days it has changed a little bit because we have networks, we have social media, where some groups and organizations are also discussing what it means to look for freedom and self-determination. But the whole thing is that we still have them. People share ideas. People have grievances. And I think it's very, very important not to close our eyes when these organizations and these small, followings, whatever we want to call it, begins to draw our attention, because it's a reflection of what is actually happening in society as well. So they are still there, and their relevance should not be overtaken or taken for granted in one way or the other. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start picking up the questions in batches, and in order to prevent lots of noise and confusion, I'd really recommend that our listeners would type their questions in the chat, and then I would read it. I think we also have some Facebook. We have some Facebook participants. I haven't logged on, so I'd kindly ask you to send those messages, forward it to me as well, and then we can continue. So I'll start with the first batch of questions for you, Doc.
Okay.
That it says that regardless of our consciousness of nationalism as Africans dating back to pre-colonial times, we remain a weak object of interest for exploitation and influence by other parts of the world.
Yes.
Why is this so?
I agree.
Is it because we lack that strategic sophistication and appreciation of international politics and how to seek our interest? When are we going on the offensive instead of always explaining the narratives?
The narratives, yeah. It's a very good question. Yeah. And I think the person has actually also answered the question. Itself. Yeah, it's true. Yes. Why are we so weak? I mean, that is what will come to the minds of people after the narrative, what our forefathers have gone through, what they have established. People are thinking that we should be somewhere way ahead. Yeah. But for me, I always say it, democracy is very expensive, and it takes time as well. I think Africa has a future. We have hope. I believe that we will get there. But it takes time. All that we need to do is to do our little bits, all of us in one way or the other, gradually, and coming back again to the word self-determination, what it means. Let's teach our children. Let's talk about it in schools. Let's begin to engage each other and begin to grow, because the knowledge of understanding of who we are is the first step to liberation. So I think it's true. The question is 100% true. But with determination, with the strength and the ability, understanding what democracy is all about, gradually, with our political stability and social institutions in place, one day Africa would also rise up and be able to see the bright light.
Thank you very much, Doc.
Yeah.
I think this brings me to another comment that I had even made here then.
Okay.
I talked about even after independence, there are still, you still see traces and semblances of the economic ties that we have as Africans with our colonial masters.
This is true.
And do you think especially in French West Africa? Because I think because of the different types of colonialism, the governance systems that we had.
Yes.
Whereas in our part of English West Africa,
yes.
we had it. In the French, it was a French assimilation.
Yeah,
you know,
it's
and
true,
we had a different. So, do you think this factor contributes? Because you are an expert in conflict as well.
Yes, it's
do you
true.
think it's a part of the reasons why we still see some type of conflict still going on? I don't want to refer to Niger specifically, but we all have
I know
have worries and
it's
anxieties
very fresh
about
in the
what
mind.
is happening.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
But do you think some of these, ties still have a link to the conflicts that we see in Africa?
Maybe I'll say yes, and maybe I'll say no to some extent. In my work, if you remember, I was just saying that sometimes we were supposed to be put under one governance against the will of the people. Therefore, tribes had to manage to live and coexist with each other. These things were not easy. Some, when they didn't want to be in a specific place, but they had to remain there because of the scramble for the whole continent. And I think these are some of the factors that have led to, civil disorders, tribal wars, and this sort of enmity that was generated among Africans themselves. And yes, a lot of researchers think that colonization also left this indelible mark on the continent, whereby we will fight against ourselves or amongst ourselves one way or the other with each other. But I think for today, because of globalization, because of the expansion of the world and whatever is happening around us, there is a chance to get to know each other better and to relate with each other better. So I'm hoping, I was praying that coup d'etats were over until I heard last week, a few days ago, what is going on in Niger. It makes me feel a little bit, but I think it's not easy. The road is far, but we will get there, I am sure, from that point of view. And I think we have to continue to negotiate, we have to continue to relate and communicate and dialogue on these issues so that we can get to a better place as a continent as well.
Thank you very much, Doc. There's another question in the chat that says, please, as a nation, how should we leverage on volunteering as a tool for our youth to be more patriotic or to be patriotic Ghanaians?
Yes, it's true. Volunteering is very, very important. Like before we had our break this particular semester, I was telling my students that it's very, very important. Go and do some work, internship, go to some places, sacrifice yourself. We should encourage that in our own homes as well. Let our children have that desire to self-giving, becoming participators, being part of the story. And I think these things can also come from homes, from our families, our parents, that they give us these particular qualities in us to help us to be able to find this chance of helping somewhere, somehow, for the society to grow. We need that as a nation. So that is one thing, maybe some of us, those who are teachers, we have to take it upon ourselves in our classrooms, in our youth organization meetings as well, to talk about these things and encourage the youth to find volunteering as an aspect of nation building as well. I think so, yeah.
Thank you very much, Doc.
You're welcome, yeah.
I think there's also another question here. It says, why is Africa still seen as helpless in the global geopolitics?
Yes.
Are we seen as helpless?
I would beg to differ, because I don't think we are that helpless. Sometimes we undermine our own abilities and our own capabilities. I think so. Sometimes that is what we do. And I think with the chance of getting to know how powerful this continent is, look at the percentage of the youth in Africa. Huge, big. That shows that there is a future for Africa. So for me, let us do one thing at a time. Take the chance to get to know our own countries. Take the chance to know each other. Dig deep and look for our own talents, our own God-given abilities, and begin to nurture these things in our societies. And I think that will take us a way forward.
Okay.
And yes, I'm hopeful.
Thank you very much. Okay. There's a rather controversial question, but the person wants to understand that there were the progenitors of independence within the shortest time, and there was those who said independence as a gradual process.
Yes.
What do you think about the two?
I don't know what to say about that. Independence in the long term. Is that what you mean?
Independence in the long term, yes.
Yeah,
I think the question is a bit confusing.
Yeah.
But independence in the long term, independence. But there was still a struggle.
Yeah, I think that is what I was just trying to, the picture I was trying to paint, was to let us understand that it started long time ago. I mentioned the 14th century, the 15th century, where various tribes were fighting to take care of themselves. They didn't want anybody to come in. And that is what I was talking. So the whole idea of seeking self-determination and independence started many, many centuries before the due date that we all know. And I think that is what I was trying to bring into the light this day. That it is, even though we think our ancestors or our forefathers were outmoded or they didn't know what was, but they had a strong sense of self-determination, even much more powerful than what we may even have today. And that is what I was trying to bring out to let us understand that this struggle started long time ago.
It was a gradual process.
Yes, a gradual process, gradually, and it came up, the awareness was, and we are not yet there. We need to continue the fight. We need to continue the struggle for a better future. So it is true. And the long term is like that. And the short term are the people, the big six, and other people whom we talked about, who were able to speed up the whole process for us to begin something on our own. And that is the differences between the two. But they are all together. It's a form one beautiful narrative in its own way as well.
Okay. Doc, you also mentioned something about, you talked about tolerance, the groups that existed.
Yes.
I perceive that today we need a lot of that.
Yes, of course.
Especially looking at how our partisan politics seems to be
it's true.
Dividing us.
Yes, it's true.
In building our democracy and in strengthening our democracy, of course, Ghana has had this very good democracy.
Very good, yeah.
Very stable.
I recommend our own self, yes.
So we shouldn't even call it. I think the cliche term we say is a fairly stable democracy.
Yes.
But no, we have had a good democracy.
Yes.
And we should be proud as a country
to
say that we have had a good democracy for 3 decades.
Yes, I
over
agree.
30 years.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
But you zeroed in on our patriotic values.
Yeah.
And I want you to create a link here. How do you think our patriotic values would contribute to ensuring that we keep this stable democracy? How do we ensure that patriotic values stop us from always discussing every issue in a partisan way? So that we can all contribute to building the better Ghana.
Yes.
That should be our focus.
Our focus.
At the end of the day. We should look more to that long future, a better Ghana. How do we do it? How do we bring our young people on board to understand the need for patriotism and contributing to a better Ghana?
Yeah, when you teach conflict resolution or peace building, one important thing that we always talk about is the idea of tolerance, accepting each other. That is the beginning of a good life and a peaceful atmosphere as well. So you're right, there's been a lot of different shades and colors of our ideas and our ideologies that are passing or going around everywhere in the country. Some of them are true, some are not true. Some are built on extremely horrible lies and other things as well. And these are the things that we need to watch as a country. These are the things we need to watch as a nation. That I think the one fundamental principle, because if you want to look at democracy as something that we desire, then one important factor of democracy is respect, tolerate each other, and dialoguing. And as an expert in conflict resolution, resolving conflicts or trying to live together takes a while. It has a time factor, and nobody can take that away from us. So we don't need to rush it, even though we don't also need to lag behind. We need to find ways that means to go at a pace that will bring everybody along, that we don't become a country that is seriously divided, but thereby creating antagonistic atmosphere for our children's children. We don't need that. If you want to go that direction, then we don't talk about democracy at all. But if you want to brag and think that Ghana or be successful or be able to say that we have had a successful democracy, then we don't have to forget about the fact that it comes along with responsibility. Our language, the way we express our feelings, it doesn't always have to be in different colors, political colors. So I hope that gradually with these talks, discussions, it will begin to create awareness and the consciousness on the minds of Ghanaians, which is really happening. Ghanaians we learn a lot. We take things seriously. And I think there is that kind of a chance that we can actually go beyond this and move together as a nation. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I don't think we have too many more questions, but I see this one. We could see the selflessness and the foresight of the founders of modern-day Ghana. I am sure if they were to relive today, they would be actively engaging with modern technologies to support and influence the African geopolitical landscape.
Yes.
How can Africa be at the table where technological architecture is designed, developed, and deployed, especially given the impact of technology in democracy?
Yes.
How do we put ourselves at that table?
At the
Doc?
table. Yeah, people are saying, how do we put? But we are already there. Some
already
of our
there.
children are doing wonderful things in this country. And I think that is the things that we may have to share more light on. And when you go to our schools, some of these kids are doing things. And nobody talks about that. It's sometimes very sad that Ghana today, we are part of this technological advancement ideology. We are also part of it. The youth of this country, most of them are engaging themselves in trying to create something for themselves as well. So that is one thing that we also need to do. I tell my students all the time, the concept of creativity, that how do we create? That should be, whatever we teach in the classroom should correlate with what we find outside there as well. So those are the things that I think are part of it, but we are in the middle of the whole storm. And all that we have to do is to continue to guide them, continue to believe in our children, and continue to lead them on, because they are the next generation. Some of us are a little bit already, taking a way out. But at the end of the day, my projection relates to the youth of this country, what they can do and what they are doing for themselves and for the nation as well. So we have to continue to do that, because we are already in the midst of technological advancement. We have it here. And some of our children are doing amazing things. Some of us are doing amazing things with technology in its own way. And we need to applaud people for what they do as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Doc.
Thank you.
I think we've had a very enlightening and insightful lecture. Doc has given us a very, very interesting discussion on African nationalism, self-determination, and he's given us a lot of thought, food for thought for today. Founders Day celebration. What are we celebrating? What are we remembering? Our forefathers, those who fought for our independence. I want to acknowledge a lot of you who have joined us online by Facebook and by Zoom. And we want to tell you that we would keep doing these lectures to contribute to knowledge sharing. As much as possible, we encourage you to join us, but we also encourage you not to discuss partisan politics when you join us online. Please, let's be very clear with our questions without referring to any specific political issue or political party. We want to encourage our listeners to come online and feel free to discuss issues with us. We thank you, Justice Datiapia, who joined us. We can see Dr. Kweku Ajimaibudu online. We see a lot of board members, Oboshisai Kofi, Honorable Oboshisai Kofi. We see Nana, we see Paul. We say thank you to all of you for joining us. We are very honored that you spent time this morning to listen to us and to join the Institute as we deliver our Founders Day lecture. We would once again bring you more of this. We promise that. We always say we will do it, and we do honor our promise. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your Founders Day. Doc, do you have a last message that you'd like to share before we go off?
Well, I would just want to wish all Ghanaians a happy Founders Day. May God bless us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George. Thank you very much, Dr. Lawrence. Thank you, George. I can see you also online. I can see Dr. Irakwa. A lot of our fellows are all online. Dr. Boating. I see Evans. I see Prof. Haruna there. I see Hajarabi. I see quite a lot of people. We are grateful to all of you. If we didn't acknowledge you, it's not because we don't know you are there. It is because we are grateful to you for joining us and for your patronage of our programs. Thank you all. Thank you, my staff and the technical team here at the Institute, for doing your best and ensuring that this lecture has been successful. Thank you also, our media partners. You are always here with us, ensuring that we do our best. Thank you especially to Asase, to Happy FM, to Graphic Online, to Statesman, and to Daily Guide. Thank you all for joining. Kingdom FM is also here with us. We hope you carry this message and help us to spread the news about African nationalism, self-determination, patriotism, and the reasons for our consistent remembrance that we must protect the sanctity of our democracy. Have a good day and enjoy your Founders' Day.